$24 million. Hundreds of birds dead. The world called it reckless, cruel, and even called it eco-genocide. That's how Macquarie Island became infamous overnight, not for its beauty, but for one of the most controversial conservation projects in history. Helicopters dropped poison across the frozen slopes, rangers risked their lives in sub-zero storms, and the public erupted in outrage. Headlines mocked it as the bait drop of doom, animal rights groups condemned it as mass extermination, and commentators questioned whether humans had the right to decide which species lived and which died. And yet, when the helicopters finally left and silence settled over the island, something happened that shocked even the scientists who had risked everything to make it happen. Macquarie Island, abandoned and decimated by human interference for over a century, began a story of destruction, survival, and a comeback that no one had predicted. Few people had ever heard of Macquarie Island before it became the stage for this dramatic ecological saga. Lying alone in the freezing waters between Tasmania and Antarctica, the island looks peaceful from above. Green cliffs, scattered lakes, and seabirds gliding effortlessly over icy waves. But beneath that serene surface, a slow-motion disaster had been unfolding for decades, one that scientists would later call one of the worst examples of human-caused ecological collapse on Earth. And the question that haunted everyone involved was simple. Could this island, abandoned by nature itself, ever truly recover? Macquarie Island wasn't always known for disaster. Long before headlines and poison helicopters, it was a hidden paradise in the Southern Ocean. Green cliffs rose from icy waters, lakes glimmered under low-hanging clouds, and seabirds numbered in the millions, filling the skies with wings and calls. Giant herbs, mosses, and thick tussock grasses blanketed the slopes, holding soil in place and trapping moisture, creating a delicate ecosystem that had thrived for thousands of years. Then, humans arrived. In 1810, sailors stopped on the island to gather firewood and fresh water. They brought livestock, supplies, and stowaway rats. The rats escaped, and in an environment with no predators, they multiplied with frightening speed. Years later, rabbits were deliberately released, meant to be a convenient food source for future visitors. But that small, well-intentioned decision set the island on a collision course with ecological collapse. Rats hunted seabird eggs at night, wiping out colonies that had survived for centuries. Rabbits devoured plants down to the roots, dug deep warrens, and left the slopes bare. Without vegetation, the soil could no longer anchor itself, and heavy rains turned hillsides into mudslides flowing straight into the ocean. By the 1980s, nearly 80% of the island's slopes were lifeless, described by rangers as ghost zones. No birds, no plants, no sound, just emptiness. The devastation went beyond what could be seen. Streams filled with silt, nutrients vanished, and chemical cycles collapsed. Nitrogen and phosphorus levels plummeted, and decomposing peat released methane, adding to greenhouse gas emissions. The seabirds that had once dominated the cliffs were disappearing, some species wiped out completely. Cushion plants, which once covered entire slopes, were reduced to less than 5% coverage. Photographs from decades apart showed green hills turned brown, cliffs stripped bare, and an ecosystem teetering on the edge of permanent collapse. By the early 2000s, scientists watching from research stations could no longer deny it. Macquarie Island was a landscape of silence, erosion, and death. The paradise nature had built was gone, and if drastic action wasn't taken soon, the damage could become irreversible. But as devastating as the destruction was, it was only the beginning of a story that would push human ambition and ethical boundaries further than anyone could have imagined. Faced with an island on the brink of collapse, scientists tried to fight back. At first, the methods were cautious. Traps, fences, and small-scale poison campaigns aimed to control the rats and rabbits without wiping them out completely. Hundreds of metal traps were set near nesting sites, fences were erected to protect patches of vegetation, and bait was scattered in sections of the island. But Macquarie Island had other plans. The terrain was brutal: steep cliffs, deep burrows, and rocky slopes that traps could never reach. Fences were shredded by relentless wind and rain within months. Poison baits worked temporarily, but within a year, the rats and rabbits returned, repopulating untouched areas faster than teams could react. Every partial victory disappeared as quickly as it came. Then came biological warfare. In the 1980s and 1990s, scientists released two viruses that had succeeded on the Australian mainland: calico virus and myxomatosis. Both were designed to collapse rabbit populations quickly. Calico virus causing internal bleeding and liver failure, myxomatosis spread by biting insects, leading to fever, blindness, and death within weeks. The first outbreaks were promising. Thousands of rabbits died, but relief was fleeting. Survivors developed immunity in a few seasons, and populations surged again, stronger than before. Attempts to introduce predators only made things worse. Feral cats, brought in to hunt rats and rabbits, turned on seabirds instead. Islands that had survived one wave of destruction were now facing another from the very species meant to protect them. The repeated failures wore heavily on the scientists. They described it as watching a slow-motion disaster where each small success carried new consequences. When rabbit numbers briefly dropped, vegetation returned and rats thrived on the new food. When poisons worked, scavenger birds feasted on the carcasses and died in turn. Field teams returned each season to find the island in worse shape than before. And the toll on humans was real. Handling toxic bait in freezing conditions caused injuries, illness, and even death. Supply deliveries were delayed by storms, rescues were impossible, and the isolation was crushing. One technician, a new father, fell ill from prolonged exposure to poison dust and tragically did not survive the night. His death became a stark reminder that every campaign carried unimaginable personal cost. By 2005, computer models confirmed what many had feared: partial control would never work. Every strategy tried so far failed to account for the island's resilience. Its pests always found a way to survive. If the ecosystem was to be saved, there was only one grim path left: total eradication. By 2007, the grim reality could no longer be ignored. Scientists and governments reached a conclusion that stunned the world. The only way to save Macquarie Island was to wipe out every single rat, rabbit, and mouse. It wasn't a small-scale intervention anymore. It was total eradication. The plan carried a staggering price tag, $24.6 million, and promised to use technology, precision, and sheer human endurance to remove every invasive mammal from the island. The idea was bold, unprecedented, and immediately controversial. Animal rights groups called it eco-genocide. International headlines mocked it as the bait drop of doom. Social media erupted with anger. Protests broke out in Australia's cities, signs reading, "Don't kill to save," and "Nature doesn't need bombs," popping up on streets. Commentators questioned the ethics of deciding which species should live and which should die. Some even accused scientists of playing God. Inside the scientific community, opinions were divided. Conservation biologists argued this was the only way to prevent the total collapse of the island's ecosystem. Every other attempt had failed. The pests reproduced too quickly, and partial measures had only triggered further devastation. Others warned of the risks. Dropping poison from helicopters could kill seabirds, insects, and even damage the fragile peat and water systems the project was meant to protect. Ethical debates raged on, some scientists struggling with the moral weight of the operation. Despite the fury and the fear, planning moved forward. Teams spent months mapping every slope, ridge, and wetland with GPS and geographic information systems. Each section of the 12,800-hectare island was divided into precise zones. Helicopters would drop poison bait with computer-controlled hoppers, while detector dogs would scour the ground afterward to ensure no survivor remained. Chew blocks of wax and flavored bait would confirm the presence or absence of any remaining rats or rabbits. The plan was meticulous, the stakes enormous, and the backlash relentless. Early test drops accidentally killed some scavenger birds, feeding the narrative of reckless destruction. Social media and newspapers questioned the scientists' motives. Was this about saving nature, or funding, or simply human pride? And yet the data was clear. Doing nothing meant losing Macquarie Island forever. Every delay risked letting the pests continue their reign, stripping the land of its last remaining life. The moral and ecological gamble was extreme, but for the team, there was no turning back. The final, audacious operation was about to begin. The operation began in the dead of winter, under freezing skies and relentless wind. Helicopters roared to life, their blades slicing through thick fog and sleet, carrying over 300 tons of poisoned bait across Macquarie Island. On the ground, field teams faced conditions that would test the limits of human endurance: sub-zero temperatures, gusts exceeding 100 kilometers per hour, and icy slopes that could collapse underfoot in an instant. Flying the helicopters was a battle against nature itself. Pilots had to navigate near whiteout conditions, fighting gusts strong enough to flip aircraft in seconds. Every drop of bait had to be calculated precisely with satellite-guided GPS, yet even a slight miscalculation could leave gaps where rats and rabbits could survive. On the ground, teams carried heavy bags of bait across cliffs and bogs, scattering pellets by hand where machines couldn't reach. Every few meters, they stopped to record positions on handheld GPS units, their fingers stiff and numb from the cold. Inside makeshift tents, the isolation was crushing. Poles ripped from the ground by wind, ice forming over the canvas, and water bottles freezing solid overnight. Teams had to sleep in wet clothing, melt snow for drinking water, and ration every calorie to maintain strength. Some storms lasted days, forcing workers to huddle inside, reading manuals, repairing gear, and checking maps repeatedly to stay focused. Communication with headquarters was limited to brief satellite calls, often cut off by static, leaving teams feeling completely cut off from the world. And the human cost was real. Hypothermia, frostbite, and exposure to poison dust created constant danger. One field technician, a man who had recently become a father, fell ill from prolonged exposure to the bait in freezing conditions. With rescue flights impossible due to storms, he was treated on site but did not survive the night. His death haunted the team, a chilling reminder that the mission demanded sacrifices that went beyond science. Months passed in this grueling rhythm, helicopters rising and falling, teams trudging through snow and mud, checking bait stations and recording every measurement. The operation was meticulous, exhausting, and dangerous, yet progress continued. Slowly, the last pellets fell, and the island was prepared for the final verification stage. Detector dogs were readied, cameras installed, and chew blocks scattered to confirm that no invasive animal had survived. When the last helicopter finally left, Macquarie Island fell into a silence unlike anything seen in over 150 years. No scratching, no squeaking, no rustling in the grass, just cold, still air, carrying the weight of the destruction that had made the island safe for nature again. For the first time in decades, the ecosystem had a chance to breathe. When the helicopters finally left Macquarie Island, the silence was immediate and unsettling. For the first time in over 150 years, there was no scratching, no squeaking, no rustling through the grass. The invasive rats, rabbits, and mice were gone. The island that had been dominated by pests for more than a century had been rendered still. But silence brought mixed emotions. Relief fought with guilt. The scientists and field teams had achieved the impossible, yet the cost weighed heavily on them. Months of exposure to freezing temperatures, poison, and isolation had left psychological scars. Several team members developed severe insomnia and panic attacks after returning home. One scientist reported that each time he closed his eyes, he saw the barren landscape stretching endlessly. Another refused to return to fieldwork, haunted by the memory of the silent, lifeless slopes. Meanwhile, the verification process began. Detector dogs were deployed, trained to sniff out the faintest scent of any surviving rodent. Motion-triggered cameras and chew blocks filled with flavored wax were placed across the island to detect movement. Field teams meticulously logged every photograph, every scent trail, every sign of life, or the lack of it. For months, reports came back the same. Nothing was moving. Even as the human observers grappled with the eerie stillness, nature quietly began to respond. The carcasses of the eradicated animals decomposed, causing short-term spikes in soil toxins, but heavy rains gradually diluted the contamination. Streams that had long been murky with silt became clearer. Soil moisture increased. Slopes that had once bled mud finally held together, and the first mosses and cushion plants began to push through the peat. The stillness of the island no longer felt like death, it felt like anticipation. Something was waiting to begin again. For the scientists, it was a moment of cautious hope. After decades documenting decline, they could finally glimpse the possibility of recovery. Yet the silence was a constant reminder of the cost. The eradication had been absolute, leaving the island eerily motionless, and the memory of that stillness would linger long after the operations ended. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, Macquarie Island began to stir. Tiny patches of moss clung to the edges of the peat. Green shoots pushed through bare soil, and the slopes that had once been stripped to dust started to hold themselves together. Within just 2 years, vegetation coverage had surged by 20 to 30%, an astonishing pace that defied every scientific model. Giant herbs, once thought nearly extinct on the island, reappeared in dense clusters. In some areas, plants grew waist-high in a single season. Soil stability improved by nearly 80%. Streams ran clear for the first time in decades, and rangers who had walked across lifeless slopes began to see life returning. The air, once heavy with the sour stench of decay, now carried the fresh scent of vegetation, a promise that the ecosystem was finally healing. Wildlife soon followed. Seabirds returned, cautiously at first, petrels, prions, and shearwaters reclaiming cliffs that had been silent for a century. Nesting activity exploded. Within 3 years, more than 100,000 active breeding burrows dotted the island, including species absent since the early 1900s. Guano from these birds enriched the soil, triggering a chain reaction that allowed insects and worms to multiply, decomposing organic matter and recycling nutrients back into the ground. The speed of recovery shocked everyone. Researchers began calling it ecological acceleration, growth and renewal happening 10 times faster than models predicted. Satellite images confirmed it. Vast green swaths spreading across the island, visible even from space. The island, once a barren wasteland, was now teeming with life again, and the scientists who had once been mocked for their bold plan were now hailed as visionaries. For those who had risked everything, the long hours, freezing conditions, and unimaginable emotional toll, the sight was breathtaking. Macquarie Island, abandoned by humans and ravaged by pests, had found a way to reclaim itself. Nature had fought back with a vengeance, and the ecosystem was breathing again, stronger and faster than anyone had dared hope. But Macquarie Island's revival came with a twist no one had predicted. The very speed of recovery that amazed scientists began to create new problems. Low-lying areas that had once been barren now trapped water, forming unexpected swamps. The heavy roots of rapidly growing plants shifted drainage patterns that had remained unchanged for centuries, and some slopes became waterlogged. In certain areas, small landslides returned, not from erosion this time, but from the weight of the thriving vegetation itself. Some plant species thrived too well. Megaherbs, once near extinction, began dominating entire sections of the island. Their dense growth blocked sunlight, preventing slower-growing plants from taking hold. What had been a fragile ecosystem teetering on collapse was now an ecosystem struggling under the force of its own revival. Animals, too, were affected in unexpected ways. Scavenger birds that had feasted on carcasses during the eradication years now thrived in far greater numbers, competing with native seabirds for food and nesting space. Some species that had made a spectacular comeback found themselves displaced once again, not by predators, but by the unbalanced abundance of others. Even the tiniest survivors were impacted. Certain invertebrate species, which had adapted to the barren, eroded terrain, vanished entirely as the lush vegetation returned. Microclimates shifted, humidity, fog patterns, and soil temperature changed, altering the rules of life on the island in subtle but profound ways. Ecologists came to a sobering conclusion. Macquarie Island had not been restored to its previous state. It had become something entirely new. The delicate balance that existed before human interference was gone, replaced by a self-organizing ecosystem with its own rules. The land was alive again, but it was no longer the same. And yet, despite these challenges, the success of the eradication could not be denied. The invasive species were gone, plants and animals were returning, and the island was breathing again. But the story of Macquarie Island was no longer just one of triumph. It was a story of power, risk, and the unpredictable consequences of human intervention. By 2020, Macquarie Island had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. Vegetation coverage had increased by more than 500%. Streams ran clear, soil held together, and over 40 seabird species were breeding again. The invasive rabbits, rats, and mice that had dominated the island for more than a century were gone. Satellite images showed vast swaths of green stretching across the landscape, a testament to the incredible resilience of nature and the boldness of the humans who had intervened. Yet the triumph carried a shadow. To restore life, the team had destroyed it on an unimaginable scale. Birds had died, humans had suffered, and the island had fallen completely silent for months. The rapid recovery produced new challenges, creating swamps, shifting soils, and dominant plant species that threatened biodiversity. The ecosystem that emerged was not the one that had been lost. It was a new system shaped by human hands and nature's relentless power. Macquarie Island became a global case study in conservation, inspiring projects in New Zealand, South America, and beyond. Drones, GPS mapping, and artificial intelligence replicated its methods, while governments introduced stricter biosecurity laws to prevent invasive species from returning. Universities taught the story as a lesson in both ecological science and ethical responsibility. For those who had been there, however, the memory of silence remained. The helicopters, the barren slopes, and the weight of eradicating entire species left a permanent mark. They had witnessed nature's fragility and power, and they had crossed a line between salvation and destruction that could never be forgotten. Macquarie Island now thrives, a living miracle. But it is also a reminder that saving nature sometimes requires choices that feel anything but natural. The line between rescue and devastation had vanished, leaving behind a story that is both inspiring and haunting. And it all began with a question that still echoes today. Could humans truly save a world they had helped destroy, and at what cost?